Chapter 17. A puzzling phone call. While Nancy was trying to form her own opinion about the Fontaines' hurried flight from the cabin, George said hesitantly, "Perhaps we were wrong to trust Hélène and Henri. They may be part of the smuggling gang. When Henri realized that you had discovered that impasto technique for hiding gems, he may have decided to disappear. You'll have to admit he was skilled in hiding the stones from Bess's pin." Bess reluctantly agreed with her cousin, but asked in the Fontaines' defense, why would someone in the gang send them warning notes and steal Ellen's Scarlet slippers? "I don't believe they're part of the gang," said Nancy. "I still think the Fontaines have fled from Judson, not with him." "Whatever it was," Bess remarked, peering into a window, "they left in a dreadful hurry. Just look in here." Nancy and George walked along the porch and gazed through other windows. Nancy's half-finished portrait lay upside down on the floor. Furniture had been overturned, and a footstool was leaning against a fire dog in the open fireplace. "I think we should investigate further," Nancy declared. She knew where the Nickersons left a spare key in the hollow of a tree for their friends to open the cabin, and located it at once. While Nancy and George went to look in the various rooms, Bess began straightening things up. First, she picked up Nancy's portrait and set it on the easel. Then she moved the furniture back into place and fluffed the pillows. Meanwhile, Nancy and George had found that the Fontaines' luggage was still in their rooms. This gave George a new idea. "We may be entirely wrong in thinking that they fled," she said. "Hélène and Henri may just be out for a hike through the woods. And Judson may have been in here and upset the furniture while hunting for something." On the chance she was right, the girls waited around for several hours. When the Fontaines did not return, they decided to leave. Nancy wrote a note and propped it up against a lamp. "Scarlet, let me hear from you," the note read. But no message came that evening, and by morning Nancy was forced to admit that the Fontaines had vanished. But was it voluntarily or by force? She kept wondering. At the breakfast table, Hannah urged Nancy to eat her untouched food. "You mustn't let this mystery get you down, dear," she said. As Nancy ate, she pondered the strange mystery, trying to decide what her next step should be. All clues seemed to have come to naught, and she had no idea where to begin looking for the Fontaines. Then suddenly she remembered the want ad for the ballet dancer portraits she had run in the newspaper. There may be more replies and some clues in them, she told herself, her momentary discouragement gone. "Hannah, I'm going down to the Gazette office to see if there are more answers to my ad." When she arrived there, the clerk handed her 4 envelopes. Nancy went back to the car and began to check the replies. The first 3 letters she opened described pictures of ballet dancers for sale, but none sounded like the ones Henri had painted of his sister. Nancy opened the 4th letter hopefully. It was unsigned and mysterious. She read it several times without understanding the contents. Finally, Nancy headed for her father's office and showed the note to him. He frowned as he read, "If you will put a personal advertisement in the Gazette, including the word artist and your telephone number in reverse, the writer of this note will have an interesting story to relate about a painting of a lovely ballet dancer posed before a forest background." "That sounds like one of the pictures of Hélène," Nancy said excitedly. "What do you think of the note, Dad?" Mr. Drew leaned back in his chair, drummed his fingers on the desk, and remarked, "It's just possible someone from Centrovia who does not want his whereabouts known read your ad. To avoid undercover agents of the occupation authorities, This person may not want to reveal his identity until he's sure he's not dealing with one of them. I can see no harm in your answering this note." Mr. Drew went on to say that he would get in touch with a friend in the telephone company and have an additional line run into the house. Over this second telephone, he would be able to check where the strange call came from. "I've often thought I should have a private, unlisted number at home," he said. While Nancy's father was making the arrangements for this, she wrote out the advertisement in accordance with the instructions in the note. Waving goodbye to her father, who was still on the phone, she said, "I'll see you at dinner tonight." He nodded, and she went out of his office, closing the door. Nancy hurried at once to the Gazette building and handed in the ad. That afternoon, she went to the dancing school to instruct 2 classes of little girls. As soon as the first youngsters arrived and were dressed in their leotards, one of them said, "Oh, tell us another story." Nancy smiled and sat down on the floor of the mirrored practice room, with the children seated in a semicircle in front of her. "Do you know how many hours a day a young ballerina who plans to go on the stage spends practicing?" she asked them. The children shook their heads, and Nancy then told them about the little girls in Europe who study for the ballet. They actually practice from 1.5 to 2 hours at a stretch. "Oh!" several pupils exclaimed, wide-eyed. "Some of them start as young as 3 years old," Nancy said. "They go to a school of dancing with classes both morning and afternoon. Once in a while, they get a chance to act as walk-ons," Nancy continued. This means that when there is a small dancing part for a child in a play, a ballet, or the opera, a youngster who is very good is permitted to take it. It's a wonderful experience. "I'd like a part like that," spoke up a little girl named Polly. Nancy smiled. "But it takes a lot of hard work and much practice," she repeated. "And remember, all famous ballerinas started with the same steps you are learning." She stood up. "Suppose we begin our own practice now. Take your positions." It pleased the young substitute teacher to see how her pupils were improving. When she reached home, Hannah looked at her and smiled. "You seem a lot happier than you did this morning, Nancy," the housekeeper said. "I'm glad." Nancy hugged her affectionately. "Maybe that's because I've come upon a new mystery," she said with a chuckle. Hannah shook her head and listened as Nancy told her about the mysterious note and the telephone call which would probably come the next morning. "Dad and I will need your help," she told the housekeeper. "How?" Nancy explained that while she was talking on the hall phone, her father would try tracing the call on the private phone, which had been put in his study that afternoon. "I'd like you to run back and forth between Dad and me with messages," Nancy requested. "All right," the housekeeper agreed. "But watch out," she warned. A few minutes after 9 the next morning, the phone rang. Hannah came running in from the kitchen and followed Mr. Drew into his study. Nancy picked up the regular phone in the hall, and a voice with a foreign accent asked, "Is this the person who placed a personal ad in the Gazette?" "That's right," Nancy replied. "Are you an American?" was the next question. "Yes," Nancy answered in surprise. "I was born here in River Heights. Why do you want to know?" The speaker ignored her question and asked another of his own. "Are you connected with the police?" Nancy thought this was a strange question, but answered truthfully. "I have many friends on the police force, but I have no official connection with them. However, I do like to solve mysteries." While listening to the caller's conversation, Nancy could not rid herself of the opinion that his voice sounded like Johann Kauf's. Could the speaker be the person who had sent her father to New York on a wild goose chase? Hannah Gruen came running into the hall from the study and whispered, "The call is coming from a phone booth in a Cliffwood drugstore." Nancy covered the mouthpiece and said, "Tell Dad it sounds like Mr. Koff." At that moment, Hannah glanced out the window. Seeing a car drive by slowly, she suddenly grabbed Nancy's arm and said in a low voice, "It can't be Mr. Koff. He just went by in a car." Nancy nodded, then continued her conversation with the unknown speaker. "What is the interesting story about your painting?" "There are several strange things about it which concern me," the man replied. "Please go on," Nancy begged, trying not to sound overeager. "It will probably seem sentimental and romantic coming from a man," the speaker said, the trace of a chuckle in his voice. "The reason I purchased the picture was because the girl in it reminded me of a dancer in the European country where I was born." "What country was that?" Nancy asked, as if she were just being polite, but her pulse had quickened. "A little country which is probably entirely unknown to you," the man replied. "Centrovia." Nancy covered the telephone and looked about for Hannah, but she had gone back to talk to Mr. Drew. Nancy whistled softly, then remarked into the phone, "I have heard of Centrovia. Did the painting come from there?" "No, I bought it in this country, but since I have had the picture in my possession, I have learned something rather disturbing about it." "Yes?" Nancy said. She could hardly wait for him to continue. "It is something I do not wish to discuss on the telephone, but I think it would be a great help to me in making up my mind about something if I could talk to you." Nancy knew that she had reached a point where some sort of decision had to be made. She was relieved to hear her father coming to her side. Nancy covered the telephone as he said, "I've made a check on him with the owner of the drugstore where he put in the call. He seems to be all right. Make an appointment with him." Nancy nodded, then turned back to the phone. "You've certainly aroused my curiosity, Mr. I didn't get your name." "Anton Schmidt. I am an amateur artist. May I see you and talk to you about this soon?" "I'd be delighted to have you drop around, Mr. Schmidt. This is Nancy Drew." She gave him her address, then asked, "Can you make it about 8 o'clock this evening?" "You may expect me then, Miss Drew," he replied promptly. "Goodbye." End of chapter 17.